This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, I'll run through the latest market data. So the African Bourses We Track on the program ended the third week of May pretty much all in the red. The all share in the EGX 30 down about 6 tenths and 0.3% this week. But the worst performance was in Nigeria. The NSE all share over there fell by nearly 3% this week. Over in East Africa, one of Kenya's tier 1 banks, that's ABSA, reported a 24% rise in net earnings for the first quarter. $22.2 million was the print there. The share price closed about 0.9% higher, but on a year-to-date basis, it's still in the red. As has been the trend throughout the pandemic, deposit growth has been pretty substantial, up 17% to about $2.4 billion. Loan loss provisions also went up by a similar margin to just over $94.4 million. Here's what's coming up tonight. We'll explore how African countries can tap into Islamic finance to help repair damage inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Egypt starts operating its first mobile natural gas fueling station. And the appetite for edible flowers in Tunisia is growing thanks to the adoption of a new culinary culture. We'll get to that culinary story a little later in the hour. But let's start the program tonight in the world of healthcare, specifically in the production of vaccines. The EU has thrown its weight behind a plan to expand vaccine production in the African continent. Now, the bloc to that end will be investing at least €1 billion, that's about $1.2 billion, to build vaccine manufacturing hubs in Africa. The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made that announcement on Friday at the Global Health Summit in Rome. The move comes as the coronavirus crisis adds urgency to long-standing efforts to cut African countries' dependence on imports of drugs to deal with diseases on the continent. The EU is already keen to promote initiatives to increase international vaccine production, which it argues is a much better way to improve poor nations' access to COVID-19 vaccines than the patent waivers proposed by the Biden administration earlier this month. On to South Africa. The country's low economic growth and its rising debt burden could combine to lead to more social-economic tension and hamper policy reforms at the same time. That's according to Moody's in its annual report published earlier in the week. South Africa's credit profile was relatively balanced, with its low foreign currency debt and strong institutions counting strongly in its favor. Moody's decided this month against making any ratings decision on South Africa. At the moment, it rates the country 2 levels into sub-investment grade at Ba2 with a negative outlook. The 2 other major ratings firms, that's Fitch and S&P, also rate South Africa in junk territory. S&P, in fact, is due to give its credit rating at some point today. Now, the last downgrades of South Africa's credit rating came in late 2020, but the country's February budget, which cut public spending heavily, has eased some of the concerns around the country's public financial health. Still in South Africa, the country's statistics agency is reporting that South Africa's retail trade sales were down by 2.5% year on year in the month of March. The largest negative annual growth rates were recorded for all other retailers. That's retailers in pharmaceuticals and medical goods, cosmetics and toiletries, and general dealers. The main negative contributor to this decrease was general dealers. Seasonally adjusted retail trade sales fell by 3.7% in March 2021 compared to February this year. That followed month-on-month changes of 6.9% in February and a decline of 2.3% in January this year. On to East Africa, remittances from Ugandan workers in the diaspora fell by $300 million in 2020. That's according to data from the World Bank. That data shows that remittances declined to $1.1 billion last year from $1.4 billion in 2019, mostly as a result of pandemic-related disruptions on the global economy. Here's CGTN's Ramah Nyang with more from Kampala.
The latest World Bank reports indicate that remittances from Ugandan workers abroad fell to $1.1 billion in 2020 from $1.4 billion the previous year. The drop was caused by the global COVID-19 pandemic. Now, hundreds like Esther Namaganda are bearing the brunt of the shortfall. Little has been coming through from her partner who lives abroad.
The lockdown comes, it's not working, I'm not working. Yeah, the money reduced. Some weeks he could not send money. So he could send like every after 2 weeks, yet before it was on a weekly basis.
Uganda is one of the top African countries whose households are supported by money transfers from family members working in foreign countries. The remittances mostly come from the Middle East, where an estimated 150,000 Ugandans are employed. And with many migrant workers losing their jobs during the pandemic, economic experts believe the flow of money from abroad will take a while to recover.
The nature of Ugandans in that economy are not getting back their jobs. That's also a possibility that probably based on their level of education, based on where they are, based on the sectors they are in, they may not be the first to get back their jobs. In that case, it could get worse.
Remittances to Uganda account for at least 5% of the country's gross domestic product. The current downturn could have further ramifications for the economy at a time when income and tax revenues are needed most.
This money, remember, comes directly to Ugandans, and some of this money is invested, some of this money is used to construct, so all this translates into jobs for ordinary people. So if you don't have this money there, then you have a challenge.
That challenge will certainly be difficult to overcome in the short term, but longer term, there appears to be some hope. While the COVID-19 pandemic paints a grim picture on remittances for Uganda, many think it could change for the better. Experts predict the increased COVID-19 vaccination and the opening up of travel will turn around the downward curve on how much can be sent back home. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Sub-Saharan economies need at least $85 billion a year in external funding between 2021 and 2025 just to repair the damage inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that in turn might spur the growth of the Islamic finance sector. The global market for Sharia-compliant assets is forecast to grow by at least 25% this year after contracting by a comparably similar amount in 2020. And the efforts being applied to that end vary from country to country. So South Africa, for example, the Treasury over there plans to sell a domestic rand-denominated sukuk in the current fiscal year. Nigeria is considering Sharia-compliant debt to help finance projects. Egypt's cabinet has approved a draft sovereign sukuk law in November. Kenya's put in place a regulatory framework to govern its Islamic finance industry ahead of a long-awaited sale of its maiden sovereign sukuk. Despite being home to around 16% of the world's Muslims, the region accounts for barely 1% of Sharia-compliant financial assets around the world, the bulk of which either originate or are traded mostly in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. Now, a few hours ago, I spoke to Faisal Bana. He's the director covering the Middle East, Africa and India at Jersey Finance. I started our conversation by asking him why the Jersey International Finance Center is interested in growing Islamic finance across Africa.
Now, the jurisdictions that you just mentioned there, which you would naturally or normally associate with Sharia-compliant financing and structuring, actually institutions from those jurisdictions use ours, and whether it's Sharia conventional or Sharia or conventional financing, when it comes to certain types of assets that they're looking to acquire, but also when they're looking to invest in certain jurisdictions.
So that's why, for example, when I looked at some Sharia issuances from Saudi Arabia, for example, you have this leasing structure that's set up. If, for example, in the Caymans, this was in reference to I think it was a 30-year bond that Saudi Electric Company issued in 2013. That's why that leasing element is so prominent every time we look at Sharia bonds.
Absolutely. Sukuk al-Ijara, which is what the technical term is the sukuk that is based on a leasing arrangement, an underlying leasing arrangement. So what you find here is, the example that you give is a very good example that can be used from a continental perspective, from an African perspective. You have a corporate entity that is monetizing some of its assets to realize value for that and then there's an arrangement being made where there's a sale and leaseback of that asset, and there's a periodic payment being made to the investors in that sukuk, which is the equivalent to the conventional bond, and the coupon payments that you would get in a conventional bond, with in terms of a sukuk payment, you get these in the same frequency. They can be quarterly, half-yearly, annually, but they're based on the lease payments that the corporate makes for the purpose of leasing the assets that they sell and then lease back.
But it eventually will still come back down to the question of both time and cost, right, at the end of the day. Because, for example, if you're talking to the Kenyan Treasury and they say they want to refinance, say, $10 billion of their portfolio, right? They already have the established structures and the connections with the financial industry in Ireland, in the United States. They know who to call if they need to raise $5 billion at a coupon rate of 4% or 3% or whatever the number is. But it would take time for these same institutions to then turn around and say, okay, we'd like to get some money from Saudi Arabia, and we'd have to then develop all these regulations and structures that would essentially give them the comfort they need to essentially comply with Sharia compliant, or rather to comply with Sharia law. Isn't that the problem here? That, you know, a lot of these countries are basically starting, you know, from scratch.
Look, I think that you've touched on a very important point there. And the point is that Sharia compliant financing is in its infancy on the continent. We're talking about trying to attract FDI into the continent from a specific demographic, which is based around Sharia compliance, and the challenges around that, you've articulated that quite well, which is, there has to be enabling legislation for governments to be able to do that. Now, when you talk about Sharia law and when you talk about enabling legislation, this is why I said it's important to understand the principles of Sharia, because what it requires, is adjustments being made from a tax perspective. So you don't need to introduce Sharia law for there to be Sharia financing. They don't
very briefly walk us through those tax implications, because if we talk about the tax treatment, for example, of infrastructure bonds that are issued here, we have a fairly clear idea of what exactly we're going to charge you for, right? The treatment of what is income, what's tax exempt, and what isn't. So when we're dealing with sukuks, what sort of tax treatment should they get? Yeah.
So basically, if you think about the conventional bond, you have a bond that is issued and is based on a coupon that is paid effectively on the amount that is lent out. But from a sukuk perspective, and let's look at the most popular sukuk which you mentioned above, which is the sukuk al-ijara, the lease-based arrangement. There's, as I've mentioned, there's a sale of an asset, then there's a lease of that asset. So immediately you can see there's tax touch points in that structure, and that structuring is done to meet the Sharia compliant element. It's not done to, the corporate is not selling its asset because it wants to sell it. It's doing it to create that cash flow. So, the regulators, sophisticated regulators across the continent understand that and say, okay, that's, this structuring is being done to meet the Sharia compliant requirements. Now, without getting into technical details of this, what you immediately see is the complexity in a Sharia compliant structure. Has a lot of touch points where there could possibly be, a value created for the purposes of that structure, which would trigger a tax charge.
All right, then a quick run through some company news. Let's start in South Africa. The insurer in that company, or rather in that country, Old Mutual, says it's paid out about $193 million worth of COVID-19 related death claims in the first quarter of the year. Old Mutual's measure of operating profit was up 48% in the 3 months to end March at nearly $130 million. The insurer attributes the growth to factors like benefits from a stronger performance in the local equity market, fewer bad debts, as well as more stringent cost control. Massmart, the owner of Game Macro and Builders, has reported mixed sales as the pandemic continues to affect the retail and wholesale group. Massmart says that a ban on liquor sales in January and over the Easter weekend cost it roughly $55 million in lost sales. For the 19 weeks to May 9, the retailer reported total sales growth of about 8% to about $3 billion. The increase all came from its stores in South Africa. Sales from its operations elsewhere in Africa were down by at least 10%. The German luxury car maker BMW will set aside $1.2 billion less than initially feared for expected European antitrust fines for alleged collusion with rivals. Back in 2019, BMW recognized a provision of about $1.7 billion for expected penalties from an EU investigation into collaboration between German car makers on emission reduction tech. The lesser than anticipated penalty, however, will allow the company to raise its margin projection for auto earnings before interest and taxes by roughly 1 percentage point. And the office sharing startup WeWork has posted a $2 billion quarterly loss after being hit hard by the pandemic. The announcement comes as WeWork prepares for its stock market's debut. The company's first attempt to go public collapsed in 2019 over concerns about its business model and co-founder Adam Newman's leadership style. Ever since his exit, the company has gone through a major shake-up that has seen significant job cuts and businesses being sold off. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Egypt starts operating its first mobile natural gas fueling station. And G20 leaders adopt a declaration recommending voluntary actions to boost COVID-19 vaccine output.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head up north to Egypt. The government over there has started operating its first mobile natural gas fueling station. It's mounted on a vehicle that's designed to serve areas where no such fueling facilities are available. This is part of efforts to meet rising demand for natural gas from vehicles that have made the switch away from diesel and petrol. Here's Yasser Hakim with the details.
The Egyptian-designed vehicle is hitting the streets for the first time in the Middle East and North Africa. The station has a capacity to fuel 500 cars in 12 hours and the ability to double the amount when needed. It can also store and transport 5,000 meters cubed of natural gas or CNG. This fueling station, like many others to be established soon, are meant to serve the growing number of Egyptians who are benefiting from a government scheme to own natural gas-powered vehicles. The mobile station is spearheaded by state-owned Gastech company.
The people now is going very well for converting cars for CNG. Now we have in monthly 5,000 vehicles converted to gas, and also the companies for assembling the vehicles change the vehicles from gasoline to gas to working by CNG for the customers, because the customers always require the vehicles working by natural gas. There is some places in Egypt there is no networks for natural gas. We can locate this station, mobile station, in these places.
About 80,000 Egyptians have opted to convert their vehicles to use natural gas in the last year, and more are signing up.
Natural gas is cheaper, saves money and gives an efficient performance for the car. The idea is very good, especially that there are not many stations when traveling. I hope we see more of this everywhere.
The company is planning to deploy 10 more mobile units in addition to 700 new conventional natural gas stations in the next year. Egypt has been benefiting from its huge gas discoveries over the last few years as more people convert their vehicle engines from using the expensive fossil fuels to consuming the much cheaper and more abundant natural gas. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Let's head over to South Sudan. The government over there says it is stepping up non-oil revenue collection to reduce dependence on money that the country gets from the sale of petroleum. The country's National Revenue Authority says it now collects over 5 billion South Sudanese pounds and more than $10 million monthly in non-oil revenue. Patrick Oyet has the details from Juba.
South Sudan's Revenue Authority says the increase in collection is because of its attempt to centralize taxation. Authorities here say they want to harmonize revenue collection.
There are taxes that are always doubling. You find that a state is collecting the same tax and the national level NRA is collecting the same tax. Like, for example, the personal income tax, where the employees that were hired at the national level and they are working at the state level, they are getting the same request by the states to be paying the personal income tax. So those are the things that we want to kind of streamline.
The government has several agencies that collect taxes. Institutions that collect revenue in the country include the Ministry of Interior, Information, Finance, Revenue Authority, Commerce, and there are also taxes collected at the state and local government levels. State governments, however, say they fear that once revenue from their administrative units is taken to the national government, it might not go back to them.
While we're talking about collection of revenues in the country, let's also talk about spending. Our government spending has been skyrocketing, and it exceeds all our incomes, from the oil revenues to non-government to non-oil revenues. The spending in the country exceeds all of that, and we feel that it needs to be looked at. South Sudan's Revenue Authority says it is working to resolve the differences it has with the various government agencies collecting taxes.
We are going to find solutions that are acceptable to all National Revenue Authority, the State Revenue Authority, so that we can collaborate, build the capacities of the State Revenue Authorities to work efficiently and effectively, and to serve the South Sudan taxpayers better.
The increase in tax collection by the Revenue Authority is yet to improve living conditions for many here. For months, the government has not paid salaries for civil servants. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
On to South Africa now. One wine estate in the country's Western Cape province recently signed over majority ownership to its labour force. Thokozani Staff Holdings, it's a group of mostly black employees, bought a 50% stake in the formerly white-owned Dimmerfontein wines. From Cape Town, here's CGTN's Renee Delcam exploring why this deal is being seen as a milestone for black economic empowerment in Africa's most industrialised economy.
The Dimmerfontein wine and country estate has been owned by a prominent white South African family for 3 generations. The Sonnenbergs say they've tried to be in tune with transformation in the new South Africa by empowering their workers over the years.
We've tried to do this in a slow, progressive way, based on a genuine acknowledgement of real people who've actually been working for us for an awful long time. So it is appropriate that they become greater beneficiaries.
In 2005, they created a company within their company by starting Thokozani Staff Holdings, which for the first time gave ownership to their predominantly black workforce. Now Thokozani has become the majority owner of the company.
This is one of the biggest transformation deals in South Africa. We are 55% owners in this beautiful business, Dimmerfontein Wine, and we cannot wait to start this clock ticking.
I'm happy to say that in recent weeks we have managed to do a transaction where the Thokozani company is the majority shareholder of our wine operating company. So it's a very exciting next step for us.
The Sonnenbergs say they are so committed to improving their workers' lives, they'll continue funding the private school they founded to educate their children.
Well, our kids are just very special to us. They have a most amazing time here in Demersfontein at school with excellent teachers. You know, children are our future, and that's why it's so important to think of their future.
Tokozani is an isiZulu word which means let's celebrate. And while these farm workers and proud shareholders in Demersfontein Wines are celebrating their majority ownership in the company, they know that it comes at a time of great uncertainty in South Africa's wine industry, but say they are determined to make it work.
I say it's about your passion. You can't have passion if you don't believe in a product. And I really believe in this. I've seen how it's changed our people's lives.
At Demersfontein, it's not just about making award-winning wine. It's also about making history and creating a legacy for the future. Renee Dalcom, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Back into East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda have signed a fifth and final government agreement that essentially greenlights the construction of a $3.5 billion, 1,400-kilometer-long heated pipeline. That agreement follows another one signed with the partners on this project, the French oil firm Total and the Chinese oil firm CNOOC, last month. The East African crude oil pipeline is expected to be the longest heated pipeline in the world when it's completed. Here's CGTN's Daniel Kijo from Dar es Salaam.
The signing of this host government agreement marks the start of one of East Africa's biggest projects, the construction of the $3.5 billion East Africa crude oil pipeline between Tanzania and Uganda. When in operation, it will be the longest electricity heated pipeline in the world. Both countries involved have now given consent for the project to begin.
The step we have taken will lead to our countries getting lots of revenue. For Tanzania, apart from having shares in the company, I am talking about 15% we have been given. We will also get 60% of all tax-related revenue. Our neighbours Uganda will get 40%. So let me say this project is very, very beneficial to us.
President Museveni said the oil pipeline project will not only benefit Uganda and Tanzania, but the entire Great Lakes region. Uganda has so far discovered over 6.5 billion barrels of oil, but there's more to be extracted.
There's another 60% of the same area which we are still exploring.
After the signing, the two heads of state declared the project would begin. This signing between the Tanzanian government and Total Limited and its partner, the Chinese state-owned company CNOOC, will see the investors start project financing and subcontracting suppliers, with the hope oil can start being exported by 2025. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Still in East Africa, and this time to another infrastructure project. Kenya's head of state Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta has received the first large cargo ship to dock at one of the berths completed in the Lamu port. Now, the seaport is being built by a Chinese firm. It's now ready to start receiving cargo from international shipping lines. CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy reports from Lamu.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta commissioned the first international vessel sailing through Lamu port in the Cape Carmel. The vessel, on its way to Oman, is carrying tons of fresh avocado from Kenya's seaport of Mombasa.
Lamu port is strategically located at the middle of major shipping routes, and therefore its operationalization will enable us to begin and to realize long-cherished goals of opening up northern Kenya to international trade.
As part of Kenya's Vision 2030 flagship project, Lamu is expected to transform trade and improve connectivity within the East African region and beyond.
As a critical pillar of the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia transport corridor, this port will connect South Sudan, Ethiopia and Kenya Eventually, the objective under the African Union is to connect northern Kenya to the middle belt of Africa, which runs from Dakar in Senegal, that is in the west of our continent, to where we are today, Lamu, in the east of our continent.
The port is part of a planned corridor called LAPSET, meaning Lamu Port and South Sudan Ethiopia Transport. China's communication construction company completed the first berth of the port. The same Chinese company is expected to finish the second berth in the next 2 months.
The new Lamu port has the capacity to handle any large vessel from international shipping lines plying the Indian Ocean.
Lamu Port is expected to generate new jobs and spur the growth of local startups. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Lamu, Kenya.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Massive layoffs in the Spanish banking sector as the COVID-19 pandemic bites hard. And the European Parliament has frozen a China investment deal. We'll have the details when we return.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some stories making your headlines at this hour, starting in Nigeria. The military over there is investigating reports that the leader of the militant group Boko Haram may have been killed or seriously injured following clashes with rival jihadists. Abubakar Shekau has been the figurehead of a brutal Islamist insurgency that since 2009 has killed more than 30,000 people and displaced another 2 million, and that's led to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. For the North, Morocco's foreign minister, Nasser Bourita, is blaming Spain for the diplomatic row between the two states. Bourita says that mass migrant crossings from Morocco into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta this week were due to the weather and tired border guards. Morocco had appeared to loosen its border controls with Ceuta on Monday as thousands of migrants poured into the enclave. And that's a move that's being widely seen as retaliation for Spain's hosting of a Western Sahara independence leader. And wrapping our recap, the Egyptian Health Ministry is opening larger vaccination centres designed to address rising demand for COVID-19 vaccination jabs that has seen long queues form outside inoculation facilities. The first such centre will be set up in the capital, Cairo. It will have the ability to vaccinate up to 15,000 people every day. That's a run through your headlines. Away from the continent now, let's head over to the UK. Retail sales last month surged as shoppers splurged on new clothes after shops reopened following months of lockdown closures. Sales volumes in April jumped by over 9% month on month after rising by 5% in March. Online retail share of spending, however, declined to 30% in April from 34.7% in March. That's the lowest print since December. British retail sales are now 10.6% above their level in February 2020 before the pandemic struck. Retailers like clothing and furniture stores, which the government classified as non-essential, reopened their doors to shoppers in England on the 12th of April after having shut down in early February. Also, the EU's COVID-19 certificate program should be up and running by the 1st of July. That's according to the European Justice Commissioner, Didier Reynders. The announcement comes a day after negotiators from EU member states, the European Parliament and the EU Commission agreed to regulations that will govern this COVID-19 travel document. It will be issued free of charge in digital or paper format, if you prefer it, and it will certify that holders have been inoculated against the coronavirus, recovered from it, or have tested negative. The EU has also announced it will allocate $122 million for the purchase of virus tests compatible with these certificates. Leaders from the world's largest economies have gathered virtually, as all things are happening now in this particular pandemic era, in Rome to discuss cooperation against the pandemic. 8 pledges have been made for vaccine development, production and the global economic recovery. In his address, President Xi Jinping said China will provide an additional $3 billion to these efforts over the next 3 years. The G20 are expected to adopt a declaration on actions designed to boost vaccine output. That includes voluntary licensing and tech transfers. The event is hosted by Italy and the European Commission. It's the first major summit on ways to overcome the health crisis and prevent future disasters. Let's cross the Atlantic now. The South Korean President Moon Jae-in will be seeking US President Joe Biden's help in securing COVID-19 vaccines when the leaders meet in Washington on Friday. The meeting with Moon will be Biden's second in-person summit with a foreign leader. He met the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga in Washington last month. Among the issues on the agenda are the economy and trade, as well as the global shortage in chips. Let's explore the latest on this. Nathan King is joining us now from Washington, D.C., the latest on this story. So, Nathan, boosting vaccine output obviously is one of the key items on this meeting's agenda. But what are the specific outcomes that President Moon Jae-in is looking for?
Well, in short, he wants more vaccines. As you know, Seoul have done pretty well with COVID, but as we're seeing in some parts of East Asia, a resurgence of the virus, and they just don't have enough vaccines at the moment. And we know that the US has a surplus. Now, Joe Biden promised, 80 million to be exported last week, although 20 million on hand. And of course, they're still waiting for various authorizations to ship out the AstraZeneca vaccine that is not being used currently here. So there's all these problems, and there's this weird idea of some sort of vaccine swapsies where Washington would sort of say, here's some vaccine now, Seoul, but if we need some later, will you give some back? I mean, this sounds not the sort of thing you do with very close allies in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, you know, you don't want to turn this into a sort of geostrategic game, but Washington are well aware that Beijing have been shipping hundreds of millions of vaccines at cost plus, what was it, $10 as a global public good. And, you know, if you can't help out your ally in a time of need, then when can you? So it's going to be interesting on the language on that. They call them deliverables in diplomacy. They usually come out at the end of the meeting. That's definitely one we are going to watch for.
Indeed. So South Korea, of course, has a huge concentration risk here because it's heavily reliant on US pharmaceutical firms for supplies. But given all the uncertainty around this, do we have any idea when exports might start to flow in significant quantity from the US to South Korea?
Well, that's a very good question because obviously, you know, US vaccines, there has been a waiver, hasn't there, for this pandemic, although how far that waiver goes has yet to be tested. But they're also not just produced in the US. In fact, remember the Quad Summit, that's the so-called Alliance of Democracies in Asia, India, US, Australia and Japan, a sort of loose-fitting, some call it an anti-China containment strategy, had basically said that they were going to pay India to produce lots of vaccines under American patents and ship them all over Asia. Well, of course, we've seen the huge spike in cases in India. They're not going to be exporting any excess vaccines anytime soon. So the question is, when does it change? And as you know, Joe Biden was under tremendous pressure to do this limited waiver when it came to patent and intellectual property waiver when it came to vaccines. And it's a big issue at the WTO and in Asia and in Africa, as you know, and in Latin America. So it'll be interesting to see what they say about that too.
Indeed.
Excuse me.
Indeed. One last question for you, Nate. So South Korea, of course, is also home to an enormous chip manufacturing sector. They basically have that memory side of it locked down with firms like Samsung, SK Hynix, LG at the heart of that. Where does the ongoing chip shortage fit into this visit?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, what is the Republic of Korea? 10th largest economy in the world, but when it comes to semiconductors, I think it's 2, 3, or 4. You're absolutely right, and there are a lot of representatives of South Korean chip and electronics people here over the next week as well. Look, there are two things going on here. First of all, COVID screwed up supply chains, didn't there? There was a massive fall off in global demand, and then there was a bounce back earlier than expected from China, who basically sucked up all the chips because essentially they were recovering and their economy was recovering. Now we're getting shortages, as you know, in Detroit with automobiles, but not just that. Shipping is delayed, and the fabrication plants can't keep up. Now, yes, the US wants to see more supply and is talking to allies in East Asia, within the Quad again, about that. There's a separate issue here going on too. Remember, the US is not necessarily trying to decouple from China, but at least make sure it's not over-reliant on a Chinese supply chain. So essentially what they're asking chip manufacturers in Taiwan, Japan, and of course South Korea to do is build fabrication plants here in the US. Now, fabrication plants for chips are very expensive and take a long time to build. I think 8 to 10 billion is how much they cost to build. They are very, very idea heavy and technically difficult. So if we even get an announcement that Samsung or Hynix or LG is going to build one here, say in Texas or Arizona or some swing state, don't expect it to actually fill the supply. But the other thing is that essentially what the US wants to do is make sure its allies around the world, when it comes to new chips, are very much involved in its supply chain and not necessarily China. Now that is a long-term policy, and I can guarantee you, we saw, for example, when Prime Minister Suga was here from Japan, where there was a much more close alignment. In Seoul and Washington, there are big differences about cutting China out and Seoul being too close to Washington in all aspects, including trade. And Seoul really wants the US to do what it said it was going to do at the beginning, at the end of the Obama administration, which was join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They are not going to do that because basically trade pacts around the world are a political third rail here for Democrats and Republicans. And without the US stepping up on its prior commitments, why should Seoul move?
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Nathan King, thank you for the updates live there in Washington, D.C. Now, in the United States, the number of people who are filing new claims for unemployment benefits has dropped further below the 500,000 level last week. Initial claims for state benefits fell to 444,000. That's essentially the lowest level since the pandemic really took off worldwide in March 2020. This unemployment figure is nearly half of the peak number that we saw last April, but expectations for a quick rebound in jobs are being tempered on the other end by a swell in jobless roles earlier this month. Applications, in fact, are likely to decrease further in the weeks ahead after Republican governors in at least 21 states, that's virtually, well, close to half the union essentially, announced they would withdraw unemployment programs. These include a weekly $300 subsidy, which businesses say are encouraging the jobless to stay home instead of seeking work. In the meantime, the latest unemployment data from the US shows just how much ground it's made up a year after the pandemic hit its shores. In April 2020, the unemployment rate was nearly 15% after COVID-19 triggered a crash comparable with the Great Depression of the 1930s. Fast forward a year, though, and some employers have a new problem. They can't find enough workers. But that is only part of the picture, as Owen Fairclough now explains.
It's one of the world's largest employers, and Amazon needs staff in the US so urgently, it's announced a pay increase for more than 500,000 of them. With McDonald's doing the same at roughly 650 of its US restaurants, analysts think it's a significant moment in the recovery.
They're going to make the adjustments they can afford to make in order to get employees on their payrolls. Otherwise, they stand the risk of losing sales, and that obviously has a bad impact on the prospects for profitability.
The US Labor Department says job openings rose to 8.1 million for the first time ever in March. With masks now being largely abandoned both indoors and outdoors, it feels like the worst of the pandemic is truly over, and unemployment is now less than half what it was when it hit nearly 15% in April last year. But that's not the whole picture. There are signs that US job growth could stall again this month after falling short of expectations in April. That's been blamed on a mixture of raw materials shortages, but also parents like Rebecca Austin struggling to juggle childcare while trying to return to full-time employment.
I worked at a correctional facility for a while. You name it, I probably have been there.
The Biden administration is using the carrot and stick of tax breaks for both employers and employees, while threatening to cut benefits for those who decline the offer of full-time positions.
If you're a working family with 2 kids, you're going to get $500 a month into your bank account on the 15th of every month starting July.
But if the current picture is mixed, many economists think the US remains on course for a strong recovery and double-digit growth this quarter. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Now, a major investment agreement between China and the European Union has been dealt another blow. On Thursday, the European Parliament passed a motion to freeze the ratification process. It urged China to lift sanctions on EU lawmakers, which were imposed earlier this year. Beijing says the investment agreement is a balanced deal and not a gift. Tony Waterman has more from Brussels.
EU lawmakers were overwhelmingly in support of this motion, 599 in favor, 30 against, and 58 abstentions. And with that vote, the EU-China investment deal is effectively on ice. And lawmakers say they won't even consider starting the ratification process unless sanctions against 5 of their colleagues and the Subcommittee on Human Rights are lifted. Now, Beijing imposed those sanctions in March in retaliation to EU sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 1 entity that Europe believes to be involved in alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang. This motion, though, throws the deal into jeopardy because the European Parliament needs to sign off on it before it can come into effect. Now, ahead of this vote, China's foreign ministry called on Europe to properly manage differences and promote the healthy and stable development of China-EU relations.
The China-EU investment agreement is a balanced and win-win deal that benefits both sides rather than a gift or favour bestowed by one side to the other. An early ratification of the agreement is in the interests of both China and the EU. The 2 sides should make positive efforts for this to happen.
Now, on the surface, this looks like a fight over sanctions, but the sanctions do signify differences between Beijing and Brussels. The relationship has become strained during the pandemic, and this deal would bring China and the EU closer together, at least economically, by unlocking new investment opportunities for both sides. European companies would be granted greater access to rapidly expanding and highly lucrative Chinese industries like manufacturing, healthcare, and cloud computing. And it's meant to help level the playing field and deal with state subsidies, something that EU firms have long complained about. And Chinese companies would gain entry into the bloc's manufacturing and renewable energy market at a time when the EU is throwing billions of dollars towards a green transition. Now, this agreement is not completely dead in the water. The European Commission continues to work on the technical aspects, including legal scrubbing and translating the text into the EU official languages. So while it's on hold for now, that doesn't mean it can't be picked back up in the future. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
Now, the pandemic has hit Spain's economy hard, particularly the banking sector. As CGTN's Rahul Pathak now reports from Madrid, it's also led to massive layoffs, and that's turned tens of thousands of people's lives upside down.
The pandemic, like so many other industries in Spain, has hit banking hard. The financial strain brought about by coronavirus, low interest rates, plus a shift towards online services has resulted in the loss of thousands of jobs and the closure of hundreds of branches. These demonstrators protesting the 3,800 jobs being cut by Spain's second biggest bank, BBVA.
Now, these job losses are just the latest in a series of mass redundancies that have hit the banking sector here in Spain over the last few weeks. Just last month, the country's biggest lender domestically, CaixaBank, said it would be shedding up to 8,000 jobs. And it might not end there. The Bank of Spain suggests that by the end of the year, the Spanish banking industry as a whole could have lost up to 15,000 jobs.
What we are here is saying no to the layoffs, because on what grounds can they justify a collective dismissal? The unions want to sit down with the company to probably negotiate a restructuring, but we do not see it appropriate to order a collective dismissal.
Economic experts say the job cuts and branch closures, whilst undeniably painful, are a necessary evil.
The pandemic has accelerated very strongly, because what happens is, if before there were fewer occasions in which people would go directly and physically to the bank offices, that has really been accelerated, of course, by the pandemic. And therefore, what we're seeing is this long-term trend, but in the context of this recent pandemic has accelerated very fast.
As well as job cuts, many of Spain's biggest lenders have or are trying to merge in an effort to help them deal with the bitter economic climate. And while these changes are probably an economic necessity, that'll be of small comfort to the tens of thousands of lives that have been turned upside down. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
On the 22nd of May, the world celebrates the International Day for Biological Diversity. Ahead of that event, the United Nations has spoken of the need for individuals around the world to play their role in protecting what biodiversity we do have. The UN's call comes ahead of the 15th Conference of Parties on the Convention on Biological Diversity that will be held in Kunming in China at the end of the year. Here's CGTN's Wanja Mungai with that story.
Every 22nd day of May, the world celebrates the International Day of Biological Diversity. This year, the United Nations is marking the event under the theme, "We are part of the solution," tasking global citizens to contribute towards a sustainable ecosystem.
Increasingly, big companies, whether it's in mining, whether it's in oil and gas, etc., are realizing that if they do not work with communities that live adjacent to the natural resources that they are relying on as a basic component of our basic means of production, then they will not be able to, in the long term, sustain their economic business.
The United Nations says climate change poses a major threat to biodiversity and livelihoods.
We are experiencing already some great challenges with regard to our everyday life. Access to clean drinking water, which was in the past readily available, continues to be of a great challenge. Food security, many communities across the world, in Africa in particular, also continue to face major food shortages.
The International Biodiversity Day precedes the Biodiversity Conference to be held in Kunming, China at the end of this year. The event will be calling upon the world to embrace nature-based solutions.
This is really exciting work and leadership by China. And I believe that nature-based solutions is the way for us to go. As I said, the theme for this year's World Biodiversity Day is looking at us providing solutions. And I think the methodology that China has put forward and the case studies and the best practices that they're bringing forth to the world is indeed a great contribution to some of the commitments that our global governments have made, even at previous COPs. So we're looking forward to learning from China what they are doing, but also to replicating the best practices.
A recent report by the Worldwide Fund says that human activities have led to 70% of global biodiversity loss through forest cover. As the diplomats convene in China, it is hoped that solutions to support and protect the world's biodiversity will be found. Wajamongai, CGTN.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. Brent and WTI crude, they've both fallen by 2.8 and 2.3% respectively this week, partly in response to the prospects of supplies from Iran coming back into the market a bit sooner than expected if unilateral US sanctions imposed on the country are lifted under the JCPOA. Copper contracts in London, they're also on course for 2.27% decline this week, partly in response to efforts in China to tamp down aggressive price increases. Copper, for the record, has had a very stunning run so far this year. It went as high as $10,747 a tonne last week. At today's prices, copper contracts in London have gone up by over 29% so far in 2021. Now then, let's move on to North Africa. An entrepreneur in Tunisia has turned to organic farming by growing edible flowers. This journalist turned farmer says she's actually surprised by the amount of appetite for her homegrown product in the North African country, and she hopes to see a new culinary culture bloom. CGTN's Adin Chouachi visited her firm in Tunisia's Tabaka region and filed this report for Grassroots.
Sonia Ibidi has lived in many Arab countries, where she worked as a journalist and a reporter for an international tourism magazine for several years. The 43-year-old entrepreneur returned home and invested all her savings in this land 4 years ago. Since then, it has become the first farm for edible flowers in Tunisia. It is located in the Yellow Lake village in the region of Tabarqa, northwest of the country.
At the beginning, some locals thought I was crazy for eating flowers because it's not part of their menu or cuisine in this rural region. Then they joined me to work the land and grow the flowers. That's how they discovered the importance of flowers for nature and started promoting this exceptional product.
Sonia picked some fresh flowers for me to eat and enjoy. It's a unique experience, but the taste is familiar. I would say it's like an organic salad. Sonia says her edible flowers have many health benefits. In fact, the production, distribution and consumption of flowers in Tunisia has increased since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic last year.
The flowers I picked and chose to grow in this farm have a good taste and smell that Tunisians like. I started with 5 or 6 seeds which I planted in pots. For example, capuchin flowers contain vitamin and boosts the immune system, especially during the pandemic.
Sonia believes in social economy in rural areas. The entrepreneur supports women in this mountainous region. Her business has created dozens of permanent jobs, as well as 30 seasonal jobs during the spring season.
I joined Sonia and some of her employees over lunch, and we discussed the positive impact of the farm on their lives. Sonia calls these women her sisters and business partners, while they describe her as the strong and courageous flower lady. Rauda was born and raised in this rural area. The 45-year-old farmer says work has empowered women and changed the lives of their families.
I have 3 kids at school. I grow flowers to buy books and pay for their education. It's a decent job. As a rural woman, I feel free and independent when I work on the farm. Here, I earn a living and I can offer a better future for my children.
The entrepreneur developed a business model based on domestic production and export to the international market. In the meantime, Sonia succeeded in creating a local market. Many prestigious restaurants and 5-star hotels are buying more than 40 flower varieties.
Growing flowers is an adventure and is a very challenging activity. I continue to research and to learn from nature every day. I'm proud of having created the first market for edible flowers in Tunisia and the region. I hope more people will follow my path.
In addition to edible flower farming, Sonia has planted a large quantity of strawberries. She is selling both the fruit and the leaves, which can be used for herbal teas. The entrepreneur now plans to launch an online platform to sell her farm produce to the whole world. Adnan Shawashi, CGTN, Tabarqa, Tunisia.
Quick run through the currencies. We're going to be focusing on crypto really in this particular segment. To say that the month of May so far has been devastating for crypto assets, huge understatement. Bitcoin is down 34% so far in the month. Ethereum has shed nearly 10%. It's struggling to find its footing around the $2,500 level. The crypto market is facing fresh oversight challenges from 2 key markets: in China, where a significant amount of mining is done, and the US. The US Treasury Department aims to make it mandatory to report transfers of crypto worth over $10,000. Same thing with fiat currency. China's State Council earlier today argued it's necessary to crack down on Bitcoin mining and trading to prevent the transmission of individual risks to the social field. We'll essentially keep you updated on how that essentially translates into the crypto market of the program. For now, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.